I'm Sue Wildriver and I'm the Senior Director of the Environment Protection Authority, and in the ACT that also makes me actually the Environment Protection Authority. I've got the statutory authority role for the Environment Protection Act and also for the Water Resources Act. So I'm the person who's responsible for issuing licences and also taking enforcement action if somebody's non-compliant. The Act instructs you that you can just call me the authority if you want to, but I tell my family this and they don't seem to do it. So there. So I thought today you might be interested in these topics, and I'm also happy to talk about anything else that you raise, and I'm really happy for you to jump in during the presentation. It's very factual, so if you want examples or more information or whatever, then let me know through the presentation, and there's time for questions afterwards as well. So first of all, I thought I'd tell you about the legislation and the teams that we have in the Environment Protection Authority, how we look after the management of water usage and some of the new initiatives that are coming up in that area, protecting water quality and responding to issues like non-compliance. So we'll start with the Environment Protection Act. So that's sort of our major piece of environment legislation, and it is the overarching environment protection legislation in the ACT, and indeed Environment Protection Acts are common all around the world. They essentially protect against pollution, is really kind of what it really comes down to. The objective, and our Act is very similar to equivalent Environment Protection Acts that you would find all the way across Australia and New Zealand, as well as in America, Canada, around the world. It's a kind of similar structure and a similar approach ever since the 90s. They all became this kind of legislation. They're preventative, so they focus on avoiding and preventing environmental harm, and all of the offences are sort of based on that as well. So there are offences for failing to prevent environmental harm. Placing a contaminant where it could reasonably be expected to cause environmental harm is sort of the key offence. So the objects of the Act, legislation, so as a regulator, so I'm a regulator, I'm not a policy maker. As a regulator, my role is to implement legislation. So the legislation is essentially the rule book that we follow, and our role as regulators is to ensure compliance with the legislation. Modern legislation is usually written so that the objects are upfront and very clear. This is what the Act is intending to achieve. And so you kind of read each subsequent clause in the legislation in relation to how it's helping you to achieve the objects of the Act. So the objects of the Act are sort of like of primary importance. So the objects of the Act are written in nice plain English right up front, and they say that the objects are to protect and enhance environmental quality, to prevent degradation and risk of harm through pollution prevention, clean technology, reuse, recycling, waste minimisation. We require polluters to make progressive environmental improvements, and we integrate environmental, economic and social considerations. There's a whole lot more that provide additional detail and that actually kind of extend that in some ways, but really this kind of thing's the essence of what we're trying to do. Importantly, there's this enhance element. So we're not just protecting existing environmental values, but actually seeking to improve the environmental values. Environmental values are the good things in the environment that we value, like the ability of ecosystems to service their own needs as well as human needs, and we protect communities and people as well as protecting the natural environment. The second most significant piece of legislation that we also administer in the Environment Protection Authority is the Water Resources Act. So again, it's got objects up front, and this is really about the quantity of the resource. It's most fundamentally about how much water there is and making sure that the water as it flows through the ACT is used in a sustainable way for the people of Canberra, while ensuring that the natural environment also has all of the water that it needs. And we take account of upstream and downstream features in doing that, and the whole catchment really, because we're very connected in this legislation with the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin in particular, which is the big water catchment. I'm sure you all know this. Sorry. um, anyway, so what this Act says is that we need to ensure that water management and use are physically, economically and socially sustainable while protecting the ecosystem, protecting aquatic ecosystems and aquifers from damage, and where damage has occurred, reverse this damage and ensure that water resources are able to meet the needs of the foreseeable future generations. Actually, I'm pretty sure that is a plural rather than just a singular. I think I need to add, it's quite an important S to add to my presentation. This Act really does focus on the quantity of water, as I said, and it's really connected to the Environment Protection Act. So this actually says essentially that the Environment Protection Authority under the EPA Act is the statutory authority for this Act. So they really tie together, and in terms of their implementation, they really work hand in hand. It's under this Act that we issue licences to take water and then require due diligence in the way that is recorded and reported. We have two other bits of legislation, two other acts. So acts are enabling legislation, and then under an act you get regulations and notifiable instruments and other instruments. So each of these acts has its own regulations and a whole lot of other bits of kind of administrative legislation as well. So we've really got hundreds of bits of legislation, but these are the four main ones. So the other two are the Lakes Act and the Clinical Waste Act. The Lakes Act, it provides for administration, control and use of water bodies in the ACT, which have been declared under the Lakes Act. So Lake Burley-Griffin, Lake Tuggeranong, Lake Ginninderra, these are acts, these are lakes under that Act. And so we do things like, under this Act, we have signs and we regulate boat use, we issue licences, and for using, say, power boats and doing water skiing, they all need a licence from us under this Act. An important thing that we do on a fairly regular basis, it'd be great if it was less regular, was that we're responsible for, under this Act, closing the lakes if there's too much blue-green algae and if it poses a health risk, and opening the lakes if they're clean. We do that in collaboration with our partners in ACT Health, who they have the technical information about the safety, so we always check with them, and TCCS, who does a lot of the day-to-day actual operational work around the lakes. So that's Transport Canberra and City Services Directorate, another ACT government agency. And also this is complicated by the fact that you've got the National Capital Authority also managing a whole lot of Lake Burley-Griffin. Actually, as an aside, this one's funny for me because it turns out that, like, I am called the Delegate of the Lakes while I was talking about authorities, which is actually quite a cool title. But when they asked me to sign my first motorboat licence on the lake, I checked back all my delegations and actually discovered that I had none. So really it's just a T-shirt or a hat, possibly a sword. Somebody suggested to be the Delegate of the Lakes, but we're trying to fix that. It's a 1976, it's a really old bit of legislation, and they've just forgotten or lost the memo where the minister provided the Delegate of the Lakes with any delegation. So at the moment, random people have to sign those, and we're trying to fix that. That's just of no consequence, but it is funny for me being the Delegate of the Lakes with no delegations. The Clinical Waste Act is another old piece of legislation, and it's probably of not much interest to you. It really just is how we manage hazardous materials as they get transferred through the ACT. It's their clinical waste. We're going to be actually combining that with other legislation to make things smoother. In the Environment Protection Authority, we have three teams. We have, most important for you guys probably, the water regulation team. This is a very tiny little team. Like, altogether there's 22 of us in the Environment Protection Authority. The New South Wales Environment Protection Authority has about 700 people in it. And in addition to that, they have a water, there's NRA, which is, does anyone remember what NRA stands for? It's a regulator. Access regulator. Yeah. And then there's also the policy people. Altogether, there's about 600 of them as well, in addition to the EPA. So my equivalent in New South Wales alone has, around about 1,300 staff. I've got 22, of which 4 deal with water. Of those 4, 2 of them are part-time, but they're not job share. So it's a really, really small team. But what this team does is they manage the water resource use through the licensing and regulation of water quality monitoring and reporting. They pick up a lot of the work. So they're in charge of the Water Resources Act, and none of the other teams are. But they also do quite a lot of the water regulation under the Environment Protection Act. So they definitely do two acts, as well as the Lakes Act. They do the lake closures and stuff. I've also got the environmental quality team. Both of these teams have about 7 people in them. That doesn't add up, 8, including their managers. So these guys are kind of like the specialists. So we have a contaminated land specialist, a waste specialist, a planning liaison officer, and they also manage some of the larger environmental authorisations. And then we have the environment protection team, also do a lot of work in the water space, in that these are the guys who are out and about every single day, going to sites where there's a risk of environmental harm, talking to the people who are the site managers, educating and enforcing the need to put up things like silt barriers or silt fences and prevent sedimentation going into the waterways. If there's ever environmental incidents like chemical spills that have a risk of getting to water, then these are the guys who go out and do something about that. They literally get down and dirty in the creeks, in the waterways, putting in barriers, taking water samples, checking that that's all been cleared. I'm tremendously proud of the work that all of these people do in actually physically protecting waterways from harm. Managing water usage, moving on to the next bit. So the EPA is responsible for how much water is used and by who. Icon Water looks after the metering that you get in your houses, unless you're in New South Wales, but in the ACT. But non-urban metering, or like the bore waters and water that gets taken out of rivers, the water regulation team is responsible for that. And there's a whole lot of new rules coming from the Murray-Darling Basin Commission around upgrading the meters and making sure that all the meters meet modern standards. So part of that is this new non-urban metering policy, which is coming in at the moment. We've just done public consultation on this and it's expected to become live soon. But this is really just aligning the ACT's approach to non-urban water metering with that of all the other jurisdictions in the Murray-Darling Basin. I've already talked about this actually, which is the protecting water quality. So we have this set of authorisations, licences and monitoring, which we use to ensure that the extraction and use and return of water into the rivers that go through the ACT is all done at a high quality. The pictures here tell the story. You know, sometimes the stormwater drains end up dirty. We follow that back upstream and identify where that's happening and work with the people who are putting that material in to fix it. And sometimes they have to this is a particular building site in Canberra, which has had a history of letting sediment out just over the last few months. They're now paying $100,000 every month to have this very, very high quality sediment control at their site so they can stop doing that because they weren't getting it right. We've had this outreach program to those little activities that are smaller than the licensed ones. This has been going on just in the last 6 months or so, a building and a business environmental outreach program where we've been going around proactively to companies that aren't licensed, saying, look, you could be doing better here. Look, this drain's a mess. Why is this stuff getting in there? This building site, it's just not enough to keep the sediment in, do better. So we have this initial approach of educating, and later on we would do enforcement. So the first thing is to talk to people and to let them know what's going wrong and how to get it right. If they resist or don't comply, then we follow up. This is a typical way of doing it. If we find somebody who's just doing really terrible environmental harm, we might go straight into enforcement. But most often we do education before we do that. These are just some examples of, like, this was red paint to turn out to be, you know, we had to follow that up to source and figure out who was causing it. This one here is important. A couple of years ago, we had a service station in Holt in Canberra that we did identify had been leaking petrol into the groundwater. So we did enforcement action there, and we actually did this thing called a enforceable undertaking, which was it's an alternative. It's a really cool alternative to a prosecution. They basically said, yep, we did it, we caused harm. And then they put aside, I think it was $120,000 for local community groups, like this Gin and Dairy Conservation Trust. And that money just went to them to fund activities, and they've just finished a fantastic set of activities that they're able to do. So it wasn't directly fixing the pollution, but the pollution was fixed. Like the company fixed the pollution, prevented the harm, prevented it from keeping on going, did as much cleanup as they can, and now we're getting completely clean test results back. So they cleaned it up, but they still had to do something about the harm that they had caused and put at risk. And so that ended up being this wonderful injection of funds into community groups. And I really hope we can use more of that kind of thing. That's it. I almost did it, didn't I? Okay, good.